My name is Cecilia, and I am ITP's media coordinator. And today I have with me Tara Ritter, who is our Senior Program Associate for Climate Change in Rural Communities. And today we will be discussing why carbon markets don't work for agriculture and why they shouldn't be included in policy recommendations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions of agriculture or respond to the climate crisis. Tara, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself, and share a little bit about what you've been working on recently.
Yeah, like Cecilia said, I'm Tara Ritter. I've worked at IATP for the last 7 years on the climate team. A lot of my recent work has focused on policy at the federal level around climate change and agriculture, and I've been zeroing in on carbon markets as a kind of policy mechanism that's been cropping up more and more. And so looking at that and why, quite frankly, we think it's not going to work, and then different ways to incentivize farmers for implementing climate-friendly practices.
Wonderful. So you said that carbon markets are starting to creep up in policy recommendations more frequently. And I mean, for years, climate change was sort of ignored at the state and federal level, and very few policies were even proposed to address climate change. However, we've been seeing more of these policies that are climate focused in recent years. And like you said, what's problematic about some of them is that carbon markets are included in these bills. To start, could you just give a basic explanation of what a carbon market is and how it operates for our audience that might not even know what a carbon market is?
Yeah, it's a term that we've used, pretty broadly. A carbon market can take several forms. So first of all, there's cap and trade, which is the system used in California. And there's also a cap and trade system in the northeastern United States and several other places around the world too, but within the US, California, and in the Northeast. And in a cap and trade system, the government sets a cap on allowable greenhouse gas emissions and then issues credits to add up to that cap. So companies and the industries that are covered by the cap and trade system can buy and sell those credits. And so theoretically, it's setting up an incentive to pollute less. Like it would theoretically save them money to not be using their credits and to be able to sell them.
Okay.
So that is a cap and trade system. We are also seeing, and more frequently, almost like more in the forefront of the conversation right now, is a lot of non-government run markets. And this is where agriculture is a lot more directly integrated. And the idea of these markets is to pay farmers for the carbon sequestered in their soils. And then based on whatever carbon is sequestered, generate credits based on that and sell those credits as offsets to companies or individuals who want to offset their own greenhouse gas emissions. So those are really kind of offsetting approaches. And, like I said, we're really skeptical for a bunch of reasons that I'm sure we'll get into here.
Okay, so you mentioned carbon markets in agriculture in your response. And I know in February with the National Family Farm Coalition, we put together a fact sheet on why carbon markets don't work for agriculture. So could you explain a little bit more about why they are problematic and why we are skeptical about them in the context of agriculture in particular?
Yeah, I'll say first that there's a lot of, non-agriculture reasons even that we are kind of skeptical of carbon markets. Ag isn't always a central feature. And we found that carbon markets aren't working for reasons even completely aside from agriculture. And I'll get to your actual question about agriculture too. But I think it's important to set that kind of bigger context. Yeah. And at least in cap and trade systems, which are the ones that we've had, years to look at how they've been playing out, the credit prices have been way too low to incentivize actual emissions reductions. This has been in large part just because they're too abundant and they're too cheap. And that has happened a lot because of industry lobbying for this to be a government policy. There's just been a lot of lobbying that has, led to the market being pretty weak. So in California, and there was just actually an excellent blog that came out last week from the California Climate and Agriculture Network. They're sharing that there's just a massive oversupply of credits selling for such a low price that the state is off target to meet its 2030 climate targets that it had set. And then a lot of carbon markets allow offsetting, which is what I had just been talking about, being allowed to purchase credits to offset your own emissions. A reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in one sector, say agriculture, can compensate for emissions elsewhere. And this is where ag gets really involved. There's no guarantee of those offsets or of that carbon sequestered being permanent. Carbon staying in the soil is definitely not a forever guarantee. And at the core of it, I think, is that offsets allow other industries to continue polluting and then just buy up credits to make it look like their carbon footprint is lower than it really is. And then a really central thing too is environmental justice impacts. The environmental justice community broadly has aligned against carbon markets as a climate solution. And I think that's because it's played out, carbon markets and their impacts are disproportionately impacting low-income communities and communities of color. And that's really because companies can shirk their responsibilities to address the localized impacts of pollution. And those localized impacts are really clustered in communities of color. And then there's international aspects of this too that other organizations have studied really deeply in depth of carbon markets being linked to land grabbing internationally and the exploitation of small scale farmers. So, aside from not reducing emissions, there's also been a lot of documented social impacts that are concerning.
That's really interesting because I think that a lot of people probably don't even consider or know about the potential social impacts of a carbon market. So I'm glad you brought that up. And actually, I want to take a moment right now to thank everyone for joining us and remind people that if you have any questions about what we're talking about today, please feel free to leave your questions in the comment section of this video, and Tara can address those questions at the end of our conversation. So Tara, I think you mentioned that when carbon is sequestered in the soil, it's not necessarily extremely permanent. How permanent is it, and can it really be measured?
So it can be measured. I think the question is the degree of accuracy. So measurement tools are advancing, but I would say that none of them are accurate or reliable enough to measure to the degree of accuracy that we need to really guarantee emission reductions. So on the subject of measurement tools, there have been a lot of studies comparing different tools, and they've yielded completely different results on even the same field.
Interesting.
So there's also a lot of science showing how carbon accrues differently at different soil depths. So depending on how deep you're measuring the carbon, so if you're looking, 6 inches down in the soil profile versus like 2 feet down in the soil profile, you're getting different results as the carbon is stored differently within the soil. And I think what's important is if you're using these measurements to offset emissions elsewhere, that starts getting really risky, because without that guaranteed accuracy, the offset credits are more or less a guessing game, really. And then the other thing you'd asked about was the permanence. So any carbon that's sequestered in the soil, it can be re-released if management practices are changed, or even through extreme weather events, like a heavy rain can cause some soil carbon loss. Okay. So I guess as an example, say switching to no-till farming, if a farmer quits tilling their field, that's a good way to start building soil carbon. But if a farmer goes back and tills their field even once, that carbon that was sequestered can oxidize and be released back into the atmosphere. And I'll say too, most no-till farmers are tilling at least once every several years to deal with weeds and, for various reasons. And so I would say it's pretty risky to assume that carbon storage is permanent. It's really not. And I will say too, there's no such thing as a permanent easement. So there's no guarantee that a farmer will continue using certain management practices forever. So even if there's a long-term contract, once it expires, if a farmer chooses to start implementing different practices, that there can be huge changes in that soil carbon and whether it stays in the soil.
Okay, I get that. And even too, if a different farmer would take over the land, I feel like there are many ways that the farming practices on a specific plot of land could change over time. So if carbon storage isn't that permanent or stable, how stable are carbon markets in general? And are the prices in carbon markets actually high enough to incentivize farmers to participate in them?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. I think we have, historical examples, and then we also have kind of some unknowns as these newer offset markets are cropping up. Historically, prices have been extremely low, and in some cases have really left farmers high and dry when a market has collapsed. So that happened with the Chicago Climate Exchange. That market had millions of acres enrolled, and it collapsed in 2010, basically because it was swamped with credits and there were not enough buyers for those credits. And so farmers were left without support for the efforts and for the management practices that they'd started doing to generate the offsets. So that's one example. There's also a lot of international examples where farmers have been paid hardly nothing, and certainly far less than they were promised or expecting. But looking forward, I think it's important to keep those concerns in mind. There are some recent efforts, like one company, Indigo Ag, is a third-party voluntary carbon market that's starting up, and they're promising a stable price. They're saying they'll pay farmers $15 per ton of carbon sequestered.
Okay.
I'm skeptical just because that's completely dependent on them having stable funding, having stable buyers for the credits. There's no guarantee that market will last or stay viable. So they can say they'll be paying $15 a ton, but there's so many questions going into the future.
Yeah.
And farmers are investing, meanwhile, in changing their practices, and especially in a really tough ag economy, which we're in right now. That's a risk. It's a risk for a farmer to change their management practices, even if, theoretically it's going to make their soils healthier and increase yields in the long term. Like, there is a window of next year and 2 years from now and even 3 years from now when those benefits might not have concretely shown up, and farmers are really taking a big risk. And so without the guarantee really that markets are going to be there and stay there, that's a lot to ask of farmers. And it's, again, just another reason that we are supporting different types of solutions that are more stable and that we think can really be beneficial for farmers in the long run and less risky.
Yeah. Yeah. So someone just left in the comments a question about the Growing Climate Solutions Act that was introduced in Senate last week, I believe. And the act includes carbon markets as a strategy, correct?
So the act is not actively including a carbon market. It's really a verification system, a certification program.
Okay. So could you explain a little bit more about how that verification system works?
Yeah. So ultimately, it is setting up infrastructure for private carbon markets. So like I said, it's not directly setting up a carbon market. It's not saying what can and can't be in a carbon market. It's a certification program through USDA, and it's meant to facilitate farmer participation in voluntary carbon markets that are not government run. So it's doing a couple things. On the one hand, it's providing what it's calling an online one-stop shop, and that's going to have information for farmers, and also things like an advisory committee, the ability for USDA to keep up to speed on the just changing landscape of carbon markets. But the bulk of the bill is establishing that USDA certification for verifiers, for people who are, verifying the practices and the carbon sequestered. About that verification system, we have concerns that it's pretty weak. When you look at other certification and verification systems, it's really important that there are third parties doing that certification, basically checking adherence to the market's rules. In the Growing Climate Solutions Act, verifiers are allowed to self-register in the program. The bill text makes it seem like they just need to notify USDA that they will maintain expertise and adhere to the standards that are published. So it seems like there's a very low bar to register as a verifier. And then there's really very little language on how USDA will check on that. And so someone's able to become a verifier with very little fear of being audited. And then in having talked to, we work with some groups who are certifiers themselves, whether it's for, the organic program or otherwise. And there's a concern that the same entity who is verifying adherence to practices should not be consulting and providing technical assistance on those practices in the first place. And this bill does allow that. It allows the same people to be consultants and technical assistants and then certify adherence to those practices. So that creates a lot of room for conflicts of interest.
I see that. So it sounds like ITP and some other groups have major concerns about the bill. Has there been any other pushback so far against it, or has there been widespread support?
There's been a lot of support. I mean, I think we'll see how it plays out. Like you said, it was just introduced a week ago. So I think a lot of people are still wading through it and seeing what their thoughts are. There is a published list of backers, so you can go look at that. It has a lot of support from large companies and from agribusiness. And I guess that leads to another concern that we haven't mentioned yet, which is that these types of offset programs are going to work best for large farms because in order to turn any real profit on creating offsets, a farm will need to have enough land to really implement those practices on a large enough scale or on enough land to actually make money. So we're concerned that these carbon markets could contribute to further consolidation. And I think, even in recent months, this pandemic that we're in has shown us that our consolidated food and ag system it's just really not resilient to shocks. Like we've seen supply chains break down all around us.
Yep.
And so we're definitely concerned that carbon markets are just another system that's going to prop up this consolidated system that we currently see and likely leave out the small to mid-sized farmers who are really struggling and in need of support and who can help build up a really resilient system of agriculture.
Okay. So carbon markets and policies that include carbon markets really aren't supporting the farmers that we're most concerned about, those small to mid-sized farmers, those farmers that have been particularly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So what do we propose as an alternative that should be included in policy proposals that would effectively reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also support farmers?
Yeah, we've written a little bit about this, and I think there's some high level ideas, some really big picture ideas, and then some more specific ideas. To start really big picture, it's kind of like my last answer. We really need checks on corporate control of our food and ag system. And so there's, a lot of ways that we could do this, through strong antitrust enforcement, really limiting industry access to public programs that are really meant at their core for family farmers. We support supply management systems to raise prices and limit overproduction. So all of those kind of big picture ideas would help farmers make a viable living without needing to focus on, intensification and raising yields above all else. But then if we're, drilling down into the specifics, like, what might we expect to see next year? Or what would we advocate for in the short term? There are predictable programs that provide public funding to incentivize climate-friendly production and the practices that both sequester carbon, but then also, like, really importantly, build a farm's resilience to climate change, like the ability to withstand extreme weather events, whether it's drought or flood or anything else. And in the Farm Bill, a lot of those programs, you can find them in the conservation title, and they provide support for farmers to implement conservation practices. And a couple of those that we advocate really heavily for are the Conservation Stewardship Program and then the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And they both in different ways, they're, quite different programs, but they provide cost share for things like, cover cropping, reducing tillage, integrating new crops into rotations, setting up infrastructure for grazing, and a lot more than that. And, again, a problem with those programs is that they're underfunded and they're routinely over-enrolled. Like not every farmer that wants to access them is able to get the funding to, be a part of those programs. So we're advocating for more public funds to be invested in programs like that. And then there's also been, some states have taken matters into their own hands. In Maryland, they approached it from a water quality perspective. The Chesapeake Bay was really polluted. And so they implemented a cover crop cost share program for the state that was massively successful. And then, California too has a healthy soils program that's been providing financial assistance to farmers. And so there's state-based programs too that can make a difference.
Interesting. Okay. So are there any national policy proposals that are on the table right now that might incorporate some of those programs in states that have proven successful?
Yeah. I, immediately have two thoughts and neither of them are passed. And so again, it's kind of a thing right now where we're advocating for pieces of these two bills to move forward. But the one that really I'm excited about is Shelley Pingree's recently introduced Agriculture Resilience Act. So that was introduced in the House earlier this year. It's based on 6 main building blocks. So building soil health is a really big one. So that would invest in a lot of these conservation programs. Increasing agricultural research is a huge part of the bill. And then supporting pasture-based livestock, which from a climate perspective would really make a big difference. And then some other ones that we're not personally focused as closely on are reducing food waste, ensuring farmland preservation, and then the last one is promoting on-farm renewable energy. But this bill is, part of the reason it's so exciting is it's the first comprehensive piece of climate and ag legislation in the House, and it would do, it really puts farmers at the center of combating climate change, and then again, getting support for those practices that are also increasing farm resilience in the long term. So look more for that bill. And then the second one I was thinking about is Cory Booker's Climate Stewardship Act. So that one is in the Senate, also contains some really good provisions, massively expanding funding for conservation programs. And that's, there's a lot of other provisions in that bill, planting a large amount of trees. But what we're really excited about is it would invest billions of additional dollars into conservation programs. And so that would be quite exciting.
That definitely would be. So those both sound fantastic, and we'll have to keep an eye out for how those progress and what happens with both of them. And maybe we'll have you back here on Facebook sooner rather than later telling us about their successful passage, hopefully. So we're kind of nearing the end of our time today. Is there anything else you think is really important that we haven't touched on yet today that you want our audience to learn about?
I think the one thing I haven't mentioned, which is, really critical, is, thinking about the agriculture that we would like to move towards and see supported. And it's important to look at it holistically. So when we're thinking about carbon markets, there are single practices that can generate carbon credits, and those practices might have some climate benefits, but not compared to thinking about farms holistically and as a whole system. And when we think about, the purpose of farmland, it needs to be to support local food systems and not narrowly to generate carbon credits. And so investing in a just resilient agriculture system does a lot more than sequester carbon. It has all these other benefits like, cleaning up water and building soil health, keeping nutrients in the soil, making farms resilient to climate change. And that really happens best through integrated systems of practices. So using multiple conservation practices together, maybe integrating animals onto the land, and looking at these systems holistically. So I think, that's another concern with carbon markets, is just looking at things too narrowly to generate carbon credits. And I guess there's just a concern that won't lead to the systems-based change that we need. And really, it's so important to look at agriculture and look at farms as a holistic system. So that's probably the last thing I'd add.
Yes, well, I think that was a very important last piece to get in. So thank you. I am going to once again invite our audience to submit any questions that they might have for Tara in the comment section. And it actually looks like we just received a question, and I'm going to read that to you, Tara. What are alternative policies being developed to pay farmers for carbon sequestration rather than carbon markets?
Yeah, I think it would be a lot of those provisions that I talked about that are integrated into some of those exciting bills. And it would be really investing in predictable public funding. And again, that might not look like directly paying for a ton of carbon sequestered in the soil, but rather getting back to that, looking at agriculture holistically and thinking about just the whole suite of benefits that a lot of these conservation practices provide. And paying for that as opposed to specifically for carbon sequestered in the soil. So again, huge advocates for a lot of the conservation programs in the Farm Bill, different types of cover crop cost sharing. And we have a long way to go on those. The programs that we have aren't perfect either. And so I think it's a long road of advocacy to keep building those up, making sure that they're enough to shift the practices. But yeah, I think some of those programs.
Okay, that's great. Well, it doesn't look like we have any additional questions right now, but I encourage everyone to take a look at Tara's most recent blog post, which will be linked in the comments section here, about that Growing Climate Solutions Act we discussed a little bit ago, as well as the fact sheet that we referenced that we put out in February on carbon markets and agriculture. So take some time to look through both of those. And again, we really appreciate you joining us today. And Tara, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to join me here on Facebook.
You're welcome.